Today's panel, or rather this evening's panel, is Valuing Values, What Can Unify Our Societies? All the speakers who've come in from quite a range of places have all been introduced already. But just to start it off, I just want to talk a bit about the title. So obviously, with this title, Valuing Values, What Can Unify Societies? The context, obviously, is things feel increasingly divided, or not increasingly, for a while now, things have been very polarized, particularly throughout the Western world, in particular in the Anglosphere. We might say we live in interesting times, and the phrase living in interesting times may sound like British understatement, but apparently it was actually a Chinese curse, but the two may be closely related. But division in this sense and polarization is actually, of course, not new. If you go back to the Cold War, there were the communists and the capitalists. But I think the difference is this, that the communists and the capitalists, while we think of that era as being very divided, if you think about it, they actually did share something in common, which they agreed on what the problem was. They agreed that the problem was political economy. They just differed in what the solutions would be. The communists said the economy should be state-led, the capitalists said it should be market-driven. But it seems today the problem is not that we don't agree on the solution, we don't even agree on what the problem is. And part of the problem with that, it seems to me, is that we kind of assume the problem is each other. We think the other side is the disease and we're the cure, and vice versa. It's very ad hominem. And so we assume the other side are not simply wrong, perhaps, but badly intentioned. And this seems to be a bit of a race to the bottom. Of course, if you fight fire with fire, you end up with inferno. So before we can find cures and indeed unify, we surely first need to identify what is the shared problem? What is the shared pathology beyond simply pointing the finger at each other? And the questions I want to ask today are loosely around that type of theme. And so the first question I have to the panel here, and maybe we could start with Matt and move forward, and I'd ask you all to, we've got about an hour and we've got a few questions to go through. The questions I have can be a structure, we don't have to keep to it. But let's keep it fairly lively, just a few minutes each. But the first question I have for all of you is, what do you think, in fact, is the shared problem we all have, that we all face? Why are we so divided? And is this division new? Is there something fundamentally new about the divisions we see? Matt.
Well, a nice short question to kick us off. Why are we so divided? Thank you also to the organizers for arranging a wonderful event. I would take your opening remarks a little bit further. I think the 20th century, and I'm being quite simplistic and a bit crude, but the way I see it, the 20th century was mainly organized around an economic division between, let's say, communists, capitalists, left, right. And I think there is now a pretty broad consensus that those economic divides still matter, but actually we've moved into the realm of cultural conflict, and that the main division is between social liberals and radical progressives or liberal authoritarians on one side and conservatives, national populists on the other. And that divide is not 50-50. I spent a lot of my career as a pollster, and I think on a lot of the cultural questions around, and I'm influenced very strongly by the British experience, a lot of the divisions and tensions we have around issues like immigration, woke ideology, the extent to which social liberalism basically wants to tear down all of the guardrails in society, religion, nation, family, community. That position speaks to about 10 to 15% of people in Western European nations, about 10 to 15%. The vast majority of people, the forgotten majority, reject this experiment, and they reject the way in which what we might call the liberal consensus is trying to change their societies. So the division, I think you're right to say, how divided are we? Because on many of the issues that I spend my time debating, particularly in the UK, migration, borders, national security, I often find the forgotten majority are with me on those positions, 70%. So we're not as divided as maybe the press make out, but I'll leave you with this. The problem we do have, and I really have come to believe this quite strongly, the problem we have, especially in Western Europe, and I would argue North America, although Peter may have thoughts about this, the problem we have is that within the institutions, the divide is not 10 to 15 versus 80, 85. Within the institutions, It's the other way around. So media, culture, creative, educational, political, the institutions have basically, at least in my country, in the UK, have been hijacked by a political class that is no longer reflecting or even respecting the values of the forgotten majority. That is why we're seeing this unprecedented political turbulence.
Thanks, Matt. Anthony.
Well, you encouraged us to have a lively discussion among ourselves, so I'm going to start by disagreeing with Matt and his way of framing the question, because I think in your picture of the 10 to 15% of radical progressives and the rest being anti-liberal, there's the forgotten majority. I think there's a forgotten group in there, which is the forgotten sort of moderate liberals. And to me, I think there is a real question here. Why are our societies so divided? But I think the division is much more equal if you look at, take the Brexit vote, take the recent presidential election in Poland, take a lot of the elections we've seen in the United States, the election in the United States. I think we see societies that are quite split. And I would say it's not unusual to have a disagreements of political views. But I think the problem here is that probably to some degree on both sides, too many people see this as an existential question, as an emergency. It's not just a disagreement over policies, but somehow it's a disagreement about, as you said, are the other side legitimate participants on an equal footing in the political game? And I think there are certainly a number of people among these rising challenger parties on the right who see the sort of liberal stranglehold as threatening the fundamental values of nation and society. I would take issue with that characterization, but I think that's how they see it. And on the other side, I think you see a lot of people who see these challenger parties, for instance, what Trump is doing in the United States, as itself a threat to the rules of the game as they're pursued. So to me, the problem really is that, neither side is really able to live with and accept the other as a participant on equal terms within a contest that we understand together, what the guardrails are and what the institutional structures are. And I would say that broadly, that is the sort of, liberal democratic settlement that has existed in our countries going back 50 years, 100 years, and so on, and is now seen as a problem by many people, I believe.
Can I just ask a brief question?
Yeah.
Just in the spirit of debate, and we're having a fireside
Please,
chat.
go ahead.
There isn't a fire, but, we've got a glass of wine.
We've got to create the fire, Matt.
So what you're saying is, when you look at the things we're debating, mass uncontrolled immigration, rapid demographic change, the rise of radical Islamism, broken borders, an elite class that is checked out of representing the majority, you do not see that as civilizational. You do not see that as existential.
I don't believe that that the institutions, take the political leadership in the UK, you have Keir Starmer, Prime Minister from a centre-left party, presumably, in your view, part of the kind of radical leftist progressives. He gave a speech a few weeks ago in which he said immigration had gone so far that Britain risked becoming a nation of strangers. I really don't see this kind of prevailing consensus among the political classes in Europe that is welcoming immigrants with open arms to such a degree that it's threatening the foundations of our society. I could say more, but I feel like we need to let the others come in. I think we can come back to this.
I think we'll have chances to come back to it in the next questions. But moving on to Stefania, please go ahead.
Thanks. Actually, picking up exactly on this conversation, I think the problem is that we somehow lost the way to constructively and effectively communicate with each other, which in a way led to the lack of trust. And this has profound implications because the trust is really, and here I start with my foreign policy expertise. I've done a great deal of track 2 dialogues being dialogues that are conducted for civil society in a way to look at commonalities more than differences, because they usually take place in places where other kind of dialogue, institutional dialogues are more difficult. And I see how important it is at all degrees to have trust and constructive conversations. And this is, the next step of trust, to seal the trust and to make sure that this trust is not only a way to communicate, but to move forward, is the institution building. And we've seen that at the end of the Second World War, with the traumatic event of the Second World War, we have a whole wave of institution building that was certainly also difficult to do. Not perfect, but there certainly was an attempt. And the best example, I believe, on the success of the institution building is certainly the EU, which, not for nothing, got even the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012 for eradicating war in a continent that has been historically the source of war for forever amongst each other. So this is, sometimes going back to why we did what we did is a fundamental thing. Now, what of course is the issue is then the trust and moving forward. We've seen also that the EU really changed gear when values and shared values actually entered the conversation. In 2007, with agreeing on the Lisbon Treaty, we moved from an economic community to a union, because values entered. These were shared values that all the 27, Croatia was not in and the UK was in at the time. This was the shared basis of moving forward towards a political union, not only an economic one. So we see also how important. Now, of course, time moves forward. We do need to update our institutions because things change. But I wouldn't throw away the baby with the bathwater. Institutions are the fundament to constructively bring the discussion. First of all, talking constructively, have a basis of trust, an institution that allow us to move forward, and to, of course, then we also need to update our institutions. But again, let's not throw away with the baby with the bathwater.
Thanks, Stefania. Liliana, so what do you think is a shared problem? Why are we so divided?
Well, so just picking up on everything that you have said. And first of all, thank you very much for the invitation and for this great event. Whether this problem is new, I don't think so, but what has appeared is the moral arrogance that is coming from one of the sides. I don't think that we actually stop communicating with each other. I think what the problem is that actually one of the sides doesn't want to communicate because treats the other side as some kind of a disease that is not gonna disappear on its own. Regarding the trust, well, I believe that it's quite easy to trade with someone with whom you disagree, but it is not so easy to trust someone who insists on you to become them. So I believe that's the problem, that we have some kind of a bizarre value alignment obsession that became some kind of a soft imperialism that is quite aggressive and completely unlivable. And I think that's the current problem that we're experiencing.
Thanks, Liana. Peter, so why are we so divided? What's the problem?
Well, the question was, what is a shared problem that we all have? I'm going to give you my answer in a single word: energy. It is impossible, it is literally impossible to have a thriving, prosperous society without energy. China last year added the equivalent of one Germany in energy production. The United States is boggled down in regulatory apparatus that prevents emerging technologies in solar. First generation and second generation AIs, everybody's talking about AI, the death of the laptop class, what that will mean for us. But it's totally pointless to talk about AI unless you talk about energy. The demands of a second-generation sovereign AI will take approximately its own nuclear power plant. China knows this. China is preparing for this. Their grid right now, they're constantly updating their grid. So a shared problem, I think we should have an honest conversation about energy and what that means. And heaven help us if we lose the AI race. It's something that we're not talking about, but yet it's something that undergirds every discussion. And finally, I'll end with this. We're sitting here in 2025, and we're talking about concerns that are extremely localized. Nick Bostrom, the Oxford physicist, has said, AI will be the last invention we will ever make. That's it. That's it. It's our last invention. But you can't even have that conversation until you talk about having sufficient energy to power sovereign AIs.
Go on, Liliana.
Just regarding energy, one of my favorite topics, honestly. But I think it's already too late. I don't know, at least from the European Union's perspective. We put ourselves in this very uncomfortable position where we are just standing in front of the pool and we're trying to jump and there's no water inside, And what is trying to be imposed by certain actors on the global stage is constant confrontation with certain actors on the global stage. But at current point, I think we should only cooperate with those who actually understood what the battle would be about in the future.
Okay, so the question I've just asked you was, what's the shared problem? But we've had a few different answers and a little bit of interesting disagreement, which we'll come back to, which is relevant to the next question. That there's a question of why are we so divided, but it's clear we are divided, and there's what some people call a culture war going on, and there's an Anglosphere bias in this because most of us, well, at least 1, 2, 3, 4 of us here on the panel, at least from the Anglosphere, and at least 2 of us are well-known culture warriors, I think, if you don't mind the term. Peter and Matt are prominent voices in the culture war, I think on the same side, on most issues. But the question I have is, if you look at biological contagion for a second, biology. In biology, everyone knows that strains of disease don't weaken but strengthen when they encounter resistance. So things build immunity. That's how evolution works. But what it seems to me we're seeing in the culture war is 2 sides that increasingly are defined by their antagonism with the other side. And I don't see anyone being converted. I mean, no offense to either of you guys, but obviously if you make a strong statement on your view, I'm sure there are people who are converted to it who will agree with you, but I wonder how many people are converted to it from the other side. And I feel the same with my own stuff. And so the question I have is, do you think when it comes to ideological contagion, do the same rules apply as biological contagion? Is the culture war a means by which we solve our problems, or is itself perhaps a symptom rather than a cure for whatever ails us? With an implied question of what does ail us, which was the first question. But do you think this culture war framing is going to lead to anything constructive at the end of the day? Go ahead, Matt, please.
I think language is very, very important. So when I hear people talk about the culture war, when you're talking about things like defending national borders, limiting immigration, defending national identity, defending our history and collective memory, defending the family, I don't actually think that's a culture war. I think that is about defending the foundations of our civilization. So I reject that language. I would not describe myself as a culture warrior. I would describe myself as a citizen who is aware of what the foundations of a viable, successful nation state are. Now, we just heard about the importance of trust, which I think was a really important comment. We know what happens when you subject nations to what we are subjecting nations like mine to. We know this. Robert Putnam has shown this at Harvard. If you subject nations to rapid demographic change, to large-scale inward migration, social trust declines, and in Putnam's words, people hunker down and they turn away from the social contract. They become less willing to support welfare states. They become less willing to pay taxation. They become less willing to contribute to the collective pot. So when I talk about the 10 to 15% aggressive, radical, progressive minority that wants to strip away the foundations of our civilization, because that is what they are doing. They do not believe in the family. They do not believe in the nation. They do not respect our national history. They have no desire to build a common ground. I think Liliana just alluded to this by saying they want us to become them. They want us to embrace universal liberalism, to say that we're all the same and all cultures are the same and everybody's equal and we're all part of this global diversity blob. and that is the only thing that defines us, that we welcome other people. But as Francis Fukuyama said, if the only thing that defines your national culture is that you welcome other people, it's like saying you have no identity of your own. You have no culture of your own. You have no history of your own. And that's what these people want to do. They want to flatten our nations. So I reject the discourse of culture war because it's playing their game. And we need to stand firm and say, actually, no, we have things that we're proud of, we want to protect, we want to defend, and those things are also the things that deliver the only method of organization that we've ever managed as human beings. And I accept that Peter might be right in saying AI is going to throw this out and completely upend it, but the nation state is the only thing that we have managed to create that organizes human beings in a fairly successful way. And if we carry on allowing these radicals to do what they're doing, they will undermine social trust, and the nation state, the social contract, will break down.
Are you basically saying the phrase culture war is not itself neutral, but is a technique to delegitimize certain voices? Is that the phrase itself is pejorative? Is that
100%.
Yeah.
In my country, the UK, when you use the phrase culture war, it is about delegitimizing these issues. One very brief point. Yesterday, the Labour government, that I've just been told is a reasonable consensus-seeking government, finally committed to holding a national inquiry into the mass rape of white working-class children in our country. Now, 6 months ago, that same Labour government told people like me that we were far right if we were calling for a national inquiry to get the truth and justice that those girls and their families deserve. And this is a government that's interested in consensus? I don't think so, because it thinks like all liberal progressives think, radical progressives. They don't want to compromise. You have to understand this. They don't want to compromise.
Sorry, I'll continue on. Just a quick question from Matt on this. I mean, are you saying that the phrase culture war is kind of implying it's a left-right distinction, but what you seem to be implying, it's a distinction between people who are engaging with reality as it is and people living in fantasy of how they think it ought to be, or how they fantasize it is, in a sense? Because what the incident you just mentioned, that particular thing with the rape gangs or grooming gangs, or however people phrase it, is itself, you're saying there is a reality and everyone's been living in fantasy land. Is that the idea?
Well, it's cognitive dissonance. The evidence was overwhelming. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of girls were being systematically raped and abused by Muslim gangs. And the expert class spent 20 years gaslighting people, saying it was actually being committed by white British men. Now, we've had a review that was published last night by Dame Louise Casey, which has concluded that that was complete nonsense, and actually the gangs are mainly made up of Pakistani Muslim men, as some of us have been saying for years. But the point here is an important one. They accuse citizens of misinformation while hiding information from citizens. It's a very, very deliberate, careful political trick. They call you far right. They say you don't understand. They say you haven't got the information to make this judgment, but they simultaneously refuse to give you the information, and then they say they're the expert class and we should respect experts and evidence. That is how crazy things have become. So yeah, I would have more time, if you want to build consensus and rebuild trust, I would have more time if the state and the political class that has governed nations for the last 30 years actually practiced what they preached.
Thank you. And Anthony, just on this, I think I'd be curious of your view on what Matt's just said and your framing on this. The idea of the culture war, do you think it is a pejorative, as Matt is suggesting, to delegitimize certain voices or an observation of reality, or do you think it's a legitimate concept?
I think,
or neutral concept?
Having begun my last reply by through a provocation, now I'm going to try and disprove what Matt says by trying to seek compromise. So, I think there has been a problem with the way in the last few decades that some members of the broadly liberal political grouping, who've been the sort of dominant group within our politics, have interpreted that ideology. I think there has been, to some degree, during that period, too much emphasis on individualism, perhaps a neglect of the importance of the sense of nationhood and belonging and community. I think that is a correction that's now being made. And, you know, has there been moral arrogance going along with that? Perhaps that sometimes there has. These are genuine issues, I think. How do we preserve a sense of national identity at a time of rapid change? How do we preserve that sense of social trust that Robert Putnam identified? Although if you look at the causes that he identified for the decline, you know, it was a lot of things, really not so much immigration. It was more, he put a lot of blame on technology, television and the internet and so on. I think there are complex social processes going on, of which certainly the international economic system and globalization is one contributing factor. Perhaps the movement of populations is a contributing factor. A move away from religious belief, a lack of belonging to political parties and trade unions. I think there are a lot of factors that feed into this. I think there are real questions about how we reknit the social fabric and reestablish trust. But I guess to the degree that I think it's a culture war is a phrase that does have some meaning. It's because I think in some cases, and I think there are people on the identitarian left who are also falling into the same trap. I believe that these kinds of genuine problems are being seized on and simplified and instrumentalized in a political way. And that, to that degree that that's happening, it interferes with the search for genuine solutions, I believe. And I think in that sense, the characterization of culture war is appropriate. So I say that, I'm not denying that there are real issues at stake, but nevertheless, I think we can find a better way to discuss them.
Yeah. We don't necessarily have to go in an order moving this direction, but who wants to go next? Does anyone, do you want to?
It's kind of like picking up from these last words, and also exactly on this kind of like polarizing language, which is met with arrogance on the other side. So both is, again, lost the way to constructively communicate with each other. I see a larger problem with this structural lack of communication, that there are problems that concern us all, and here I'm thinking at the SDGs, for example, that suddenly are out of the picture entirely. Climate change, which is going nowhere, if anything, is even worsening. How to deal with AI. These are things, these are problems that if, you know, by having a reprioritizing another kind of discussion and not looking at the strategically how to address this problem and postponing, therefore, the decisions later, these problems will simply come back at us in 5 to 10 years, or whenever they will be, with a much higher price. So I find it simply not strategic at all to have this, again, broken communication, because it doesn't allow us to deal with problems that are there. And they will go nowhere. And if we don't deal with them today, we will have to deal with a higher price tomorrow.
Thanks. Liliana?
You know, we're in Hungary, we're in Budapest, the most beautiful capital, most beautiful city. And, you know, if we look at the media, how they were behaving towards Hungary, Hungary was actually called, I think, everything, from illiberal to inconvenient. And when I'm thinking about it, maybe it's not the inconvenience that the value that we share here, but maybe it's rather the fact that we have some values. Maybe that's the problem. And regarding the cultural war, whether it's a cure, no, I don't think so. I think it's rather a symptom of something deeper, some kind of a identity crisis that our civilization is now experiencing. Whether winning it would be a solution, I don't think so. I think we should rather outgrow it. We should come back to the foundations, family, faith, duty. Maybe that would be the thing that would help it.
I'm just curious, I find that a really interesting notion. Could you talk about that for a second? The idea that we outgrow the divisions? Like, flesh that out if you don't mind.
Well, putting more and more arguments and presenting both of the sides as a diseases, as Callum mentioned in the beginning of the panel, I don't think it's a solution. I don't want to actually sound now as some moral, arrogant lady sitting here, but maybe we should be smarter than the other side at a certain point.
Yeah, my concern, piggybacking off of what Matt said, is that there really are people who are in existential crisis. There really are people, I mean, there's a whole line of literature called queering. You want to queer the family, you want to queer the nation, you want to queer, it doesn't mean what people think it means. It doesn't mean like the pejorative word for gay. It means you want to take a look at something to delegitimize it. And so there really are forces that are aligned for open borders, for example. I mean, my good friend Faisal Al-Mutar said to me a long time ago, he runs Ideas Beyond Borders. I said to him, I don't understand why Islamists don't want secularism. It seemed like they would think this is a great idea. You could have your religion, they could have their religion, they could do whatever they want to do. He said, no. It's not that they don't want their religion, it's that they want you to have their religion. So the Iranian Revolutionary Guard isn't sitting there thinking, oh, geez, what qualities what would it take for me to revise my belief? That's a virtue in critical thinking. What's left of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, hopefully not much. But so people who are extraordinarily dogmatic, they have access to the tools of the Enlightenment and Western liberalism, but they think it's a virtue not to use those tools. So you're dealing with people who are entrenched ideologues. And certainly not everybody who's an entrenched ideologue wants to destroy the fabric of society, but we certainly have enough of them, a non-trivial number of them, to make it a significant threat about which we should be profoundly concerned in the Western society. And Matt's done fantastic work at great personal expense to himself highlighting that. So I think we need to be, the first step in solving any problems is that we just have to be honest about what the problem is. We have a large number of people who despise the West and want to utterly destroy it.
Okay, so moving on, I mean, another question for you guys is that, I mean, one thing I've been thinking about is, and we haven't really talked about this, but when we talked about the problem, what is the problem? I have to say, one of the things I often think is the problem is the neoliberal era we've been living in, because it seems to be that the neoliberal era has hollowed out communities that have led to a lot of the sort of neo-nationalist reshoring politics. And at the same time, if you look at a lot of the so-called woke identity politics stuff, mostly people are acting as sort of entrepreneurs of themselves. I mean, in the 80s, we were told be entrepreneurs of your wealth. In the 90s, be entrepreneurs of your health. So, go to the gym and so on. And now we're being told being entrepreneurs of yourself, be more moral, be more of a moral actor. And if you look at what's happened across the spectrum, the people who vote for, say, Trump, all their jobs went to China decades ago. There's a reason why if you look at the American sort of provincial suburbs, in the 80s it was a utopia. Movies like E.T. were based there. Now it's always a dystopia about drug addiction and black water and so on. So these are the same communities. But then if you look at the woke people, less in the middle America, but in the cities, in New York and so on, those people are, if you think of their circumstance, if you're a young person in New York, you've got massive student debt, you can't find a secure job, you can't afford a house or unaffordable, you got no job security, but the one thing you can say is you're a good person. It's like a Franciscan monk, they have bare feet, but I'm such a good person. So it seems to be that both sides are suffering this neoliberal they're both, as much as they dislike each other, the core problem they're both facing seems to be the consequences of a neoliberal period. But the question in this view is that, is to some extent the problem perhaps that we're living in a culture where we are all construed as consumers before we're construed as citizens or simply people. In a sense, do we live in a culture that knows the price of everything, quite literally, and the value of nothing? I mean, in a previous generation, if you go to World War II, the greatest generation, as we call them in the UK, they suffered total war, bombings of cities. But you could argue now we're suffering a period of total economics the last few decades. that everything has just been colonized by economic interest. Everything in our lives now is, and even today in particular, increasingly, have you noticed, everything we do is a subscription service. You used to own Microsoft Word, and now you subscribe to Microsoft Word. We used to own a car, but Tesla and so on are trying to bring in subscription services to cars. We're going to own nothing in a sense, but everything has been rendered sort of an economic phenomenon. So my point here is, in this long monologue, do you think neoliberalism has some responsibility for what we see now in terms of the decline of values and perhaps the debate over them? Whoever wants to, maybe Peter, we start. So.
No, absolutely unconditionally not. I think I'm a big fan of American soft power. I'm a big fan of American goodies, TVs, movies, music. I'm a big fan of that influencing particularly illiberal regimes. I think I was Pollyanna at one point, and I thought, well, geez, if we could just export enough of our culture around the world, then China could be liberalized. Democracy, cognitive liberty, basic freedoms come from free markets. But one of the things that I learned over time is that we have become illiberal to access Chinese markets, and that's a problem. I don't think that framing it in terms of neoliberalism is the way to think about the problem. I think the way to think about the problem is, it's complicated in a brief talk, but Dawkins in The Selfish Gene talks about memetics. How do ideas spread? 30-second summary of how ideas spread. They spread one of two ways. They spread because they're sticky. There are good sticky and bad sticky. Bad sticky is political correctness, blasphemy laws, etc. Those allow bad ideas to prosper. Good sticky is the scientific method. The means of error correction have been maintained. Science, anything in science, method of error correction. I think thinking about the problem in terms of neoliberalism is itself the problem, and I don't accept the framing of the question. I think the framing of the question is more in terms of how free markets and the free flow of particularly cultural artifacts, movies, music, etc., have spread and influenced people in various societies, particularly closed and totalitarian societies. If anything, I would do, here's my idea. If anything, forget sanctions. I would do reverse sanctions. I would dump all of our stuff on them. Free movies, free music, free everything. I'd go over North Korea and I'd blanket the whole place with free CDs for everybody, free American culture for everybody.
But can I just say, it's not free though, because if you've got a social media account and you don't pay for it, someone's paying for it, and it's the advertiser. And so and the algorithm's designed to, they know that it's easier to lose trust than build trust. And if it takes longer to build trust, it's more expensive. So it's more divisive.
People vote with their feet. There's a reason that people are emigrating to the West. It's cheesy, but it's true. The West really is the best. We have people vote with their feet. They don't just want goodies. They want the freedoms and the life. Look, nobody wants the secret police kicking down their door at 4 a.m. Nobody. No matter what you want to say about Trump and Kings, nobody is kicking your door down at 4 a.m. in the United States.
They are in the UK.
They are in the UK. They are in the UK, and you're losing some fundamental freedoms. And you should perhaps talk about neoliberalism and free speech, because you're losing it, and you're losing it fast.
Well, my read on that is we have a liberal class that likes to think of itself as being liberal, but actually can now sense that they are losing power and they have no real option left other than to try and control the parameters of the national conversation. And that's why, for example, in my country, which was the home of Magna Carta, free speech, individual liberty, common law, all of those things, we now have a very sustained, concerted clampdown on free speech through non-crime hate incidents, hate laws, expanded definitions of Islamophobia, social taboos like far right and xenophobia that are all used to try and control the narrative. Because at the root of that, to get back to the question, I think the people who have presided over, let's just call it the liberal consensus of the last 30 years, I think have realized that it's over, that the philosophy has run its course. It is not strong enough to fend off the new threats, and I would argue Islamism is a principal threat to liberal societies that is more compelling and captivating for many people that are coming into those societies. I released a report recently, I've written about it. We use the top forecasters in the UK. By 2063, okay, which is not a long way away, don't know how old you'll be, but most of us, I suspect, will be alive. By 2063, white Britons will be a minority. And by 2079, there will be more people in the UK who are not born in the UK than people who can trace their roots back in that country. And by the end of this century, 1 in every 4 people in the UK will be following Islam, and 1 in 3 of the under 40s will be following Islam. Okay, that's the pace of change that you were looking at. Now, the liberal answer to that is, well, what's the problem? Individual rights, blah, blah, blah. But in that kind of nation, you don't have anything that is actually strong enough to unite those people around a shared identity, a shared sense of values, a shared history. So I guess I'd throw the question back almost, Callum, and say, well, if liberalism, if the liberal consensus, whatever you want to call it, neoliberalism, has run its course, well, what on earth is coming next? Because I don't think anybody out there yet has got the answer. I've personally not been quite convinced by the post-liberals. I see the signs of a revival in Christianity, and I see the data on that, but it's nowhere near as dramatic enough as you would need to provide a counter to those wider challenges. So if the liberal experiment is over, what's coming next?
Thanks, Matt.
Can
Anthony,
I
go ahead.
come in?
Please.
So I think there are genuine questions about how liberal societies should tolerate individuals who have illiberal views, whether that's Islamists or political extremists. At what point does the right to free speech become incitement to violence? At what point is, should we, for the sake of public order, restrict certain forms of protest? At what point does it become harassment? These are genuine questions. And I am totally prepared to concede that in some cases, governments have gone too far. I think it is a gross exaggeration to equate that with the death of freedom of speech in the UK.
Okay, so a couple of examples. The definition of Islamophobia that Keir Starmer is bringing in this week, the Labour government that you were just pointing to, the definition of that included discussing the rape gangs as an example of Islamophobia. Is that going too far?
I'm not familiar with the details of the legislation, but clearly the government... Hold on a second.
What about Germany? What about Germany shutting down or trying to shut down
I'm sorry.
the alternative for Germany?
Sorry. Could you just please answer that question? Is that going too far? I'd like to know.
As I say, I'm not familiar with the details of that particular piece of legislation, but the idea that this government has banned all discussion of the rape gangs when they've just instituted a national inquiry seems to me quite far-fetched.
Okay, 6 months ago, sorry, for those of you not in the UK, I'm sorry if I'm going down a UK point, but this is important because it's about the liberal experiment. It's about language and it's about free speech, okay? 6 months ago, this Labour government said anybody who talked about the mass rape of our children was a far-right activist. Keir Starmer said you were jumping on a far-right bandwagon.
That's very different from saying you're a far-right activist, to even discuss it. This is something which has been...
Keir Starmer said...
There hasn't been a national inquiry, but there have been local inquiries.
He said, if you are calling for a national inquiry into the rape gangs, you were jumping on the bandwagon of the far right. That was his quote.
The report that was issued yesterday, when was that commissioned?
In January. It took 6 months of continued public pressure to force a Labour government, just think about this, to force a government to launch an inquiry into the mass rape of children. But imagine if those children were black. How quick would liberal progressives respond? Imagine, look, George Floyd, for goodness sake, Stephen Lawrence, the Windrush scandal. Let's be honest, liberal progressives, they view society in a very biased two-tier way. Now, to get back to the question, They use the hate laws and the free speech clampdown, the censorship complex, because they're losing the argument. And the reason they struggle with Hungary, and I know this because I've experienced it myself, the reason the liberal class don't know what to do with Hungary, particularly in countries like the UK, is because they're not used to nations standing up for their identity and their borders and their history. They're not used to it. I had a very peculiar experience flying back from Hungary last year, where I'd been in Budapest for a week. Actually, I'd been sort of traveling around. I'd gone to various things with MCC, and I had observed basically Hungary and how it was functioning. And I flew back into London Luton, and I was struck by the contrast, because the liberal elite in the UK are saying, well, here's this slightly strange conservative country in Eastern Europe, you know, and there are all kinds of stereotypes and accusations that are thrown around. And as I fly back into the UK last summer, we have widespread rioting, we have protests, we have people taking to the streets because of mass immigration, because the son of Rwandan immigrants had murdered 3 little girls at a dance class. And the Labour government, Keir Starmer and others, are rushing to basically demonize anybody who's protesting, including throwing a woman called Lucy Connolly into prison for the best part of 3 years because she tweeted something that they found to be offensive. Okay? So the contrast between what I observed here and what I observed in the UK could not be starker. And when I made that observation on Twitter, the liberal class had a meltdown. How dare you say something positive about an East European country?
I think we have to distinguish between the legitimate right to protest and attempts to storm and set on fire.
So Lucy Connolly should have been sent to prison for 3 years.
I'm not talking about
I'm going to have to intervene a little bit.
I'm talking about what you described as the protests.
A lot of the protests were peaceful.
Yeah, but the people who were being charged were charged with crimes of violence, not with peaceful protest.
Lucy Connolly went to prison for the best part of 3 years because she sent a tweet. It's important for people who don't understand.
You're changing the subject. That is not to do with the
protests
protests that we saw. That
I
was a
hate to
separate
interrupt.
discussion.
May I throw myself into it slightly, because I do agree to some degree of some elements, but especially on the discussion about freedom of speech, I have actually a different way of reading it, which is, given the difficulties that we have with talking with humans, somehow there's this weird relation that is going on where the human-driven bureaucracy, which has been the foundation of civilization since the time of Egyptians, is somehow emptying its trust, and we're putting ourselves more trust into the AI. And it is not absurd to think that in the future we will have an AI-driven bureaucracy. Now, why does it relate with freedom of speech? AI is driven by algorithm. It is not, we do not see the same thing. So it is excessively difficult to have an objective view when we deal with social media, and we deal, you know, in a future where AI will rule our life to the point of having potentially a bureaucracy, because we should not exclude that in the future. That I find it really problematic, because in that situation we will all have, if today it is difficult to talk, tomorrow it will be impossible.
Liliana.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Matt, did you mention that there's a revival of Christianity? Did you mention that there's a revival of Christianity?
There is some pretty convincing data that there is a revival among young people in Europe.
There is some. Yeah, there is some data.
I don't know. I disagree. Unfortunately, well, I don't know. I'm sorry, because I just want to say that I rather feel like we're in some kind of a spiritual vacuum if we look at the actual data, and I'm talking from the Polish perspective, which probably appears to be one of the most Catholic countries in Europe. And if you look at the data between 1992 and 2022, unfortunately, those who are actually, let's say, presenting themselves as believers and those who are practitioners is dropping tremendously, especially within the younger generation. And that's the question, whether actually the life that is right now about consumption is a problem, I think so. I think life is now too easy.
Well, I mean, we've only got a few minutes left, about 5 minutes left, and so I'm going to ask you all just to say something fairly short. But to end, we've talked about what the problem is and what is the state of things now, and I want to end in terms of where things are going. And you mentioned the Christian revival. So there's been a lot of talk recently of church numbers being up and so on. It's still quite low, but like in France last year, there were 7,000 adults baptized on Easter Vigil, and that was a 32 increase on year. And there is small, nascent, sapling sort of evidence of this. But the question is, do we see there being some sort of, well, what would have to change in order to reestablish a sense of unifying values? I mean, the thing is really interesting. You two had a bit of a debate there, which is good, actually. It's nice to see a debate on a panel. But actually, it's interesting, though, looking at you two to discuss things, because I think you two are talking from different frames of reference. I don't look at either of you think you're wrong or right. I think you've got a political interpretation, he's got a legal interpretation. And I think those are legitimate different ways of approaching the problem. And so my last comment, and then I think, well, maybe we're always speaking past each other, is what I keep thinking. And so my last question for all of you is, what do you think is the way forward? It could be Christianity. It could be simply finding out, asking each other, well, where are you coming from? Where do you think the solution to our woes lie? And just very quickly, I'll give you a minute each. Who wants to start? Any order?
I'll go for it. So I think the way forward is to, when you're in a conversation, it's my last book, How to Have Impossible Conversations, the first thing you want to do is you want to listen to somebody and then repeat back to them what you think you heard. This is Rappaport's first rule. And then what you're looking for is for them ultimately to say that's right. So first you need to listen to what somebody is saying. I think there are attitudinal dispositions that are really important, like the willingness to change your mind, et cetera. But I'm going to take my remaining 30 seconds and ask you, what was the question you asked him again? Exactly, what was the question?
Well, I was asking about the definition of Islamophobia.
Yeah, and you gave him an example, and what was the example?
So the original definition, which was supported by the Labour Party, included talking about the rape gangs as an example of Islamophobia.
Okay, I just want a show of hands. This is very important and salient.
Go ahead.
We're doing.
But quickly.
Who thinks that talking about rape gangs is a type of Islamophobia? Raise your hand.
I will raise my hand.
Okay.
You're right to ask the question afterwards.
After, because I'm already at my end of my time.
Well, that's my prerogative to decide that.
So
I'll leave you in hope.
here's the thing. So when you talk about free speech, you also have to be willing to accept that someone can criticize your religion. Or if you're an atheist, no religion.
Yeah. Okay, right. Liliana, quickly, let's wrap this up fairly quickly.
Now quickly,
Yeah. Well, no, I've been trying to.
I have 1 minute that I will use.
You're 1 minute. 1 minute, I meant quickly.
No, I would say in a discussion, less emotions, more constructive dialogue. I'm happy that we are here and we can discuss. I'm still, I don't think there's revival of Christianity, few baptism, and a couple of guys on the podcast who will say that they found the faith. I don't think it's a good sign on the horizon.
Anecdote is not data. Okay, you got 30 seconds? No, okay. Stefania.
I would actually pick one of the 10 commandments, which I believe implies it applies to humanity. Do not envy, and this is first to establish a more constructive dialogue. But there's also a side on climate change. We do have, and there was a little bit of a discussion before, on how not to continue with this endless growth, endless production, endless waste, endless pollution, and having a little bit more of a restraint and satisfaction with what you have. I think we would definitely be an improvement of current situation.
My policy is to give the last word to whoever's traveled the furthest to be here. So I'm going to end with Anthony and Matt. Go ahead.
So in the early 90s, one of my favorite writers, Christopher Lasch, was dying was dying from cancer, and he wrote a book called Revolt of the Elites, in which he said, the next big political revolution will not be the masses rising up against the elite. It will be the elite rising up against the masses, which is what we're living through at the moment. The censorship industrial complex, top-down, aggressive, authoritarian liberalism being used to basically try and push and coerce countries into adopting this liberal experiment. To fix it, the way forward is compromise, but not in the way that we usually talk about compromise. It is, and I've been saying this for more than 10 years, it is now on the people who have governed our societies in the West for the last 30 years to make a compromise with voters. If you do not do that, Donald Trump will be re-elected. Marine Le Pen's party will become the governing party in France. The AfD will run Germany. Brexit will happen. Nigel Farage will become prime minister. Unless the people who govern Western nations understand they have to make a compromise with voters, which means lower migration, control the borders. Don't try and tell me little boys can become little girls and little girls can become little boys. Believe in science, believe in truth, believe in debate. Don't disrespect your fellow citizens by calling them gammons and deplorables or saying they're far right because they care about the mass rape of their children. Make a compromise. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. And finally, Anthony.
I don't think that in societies that are diverse and that are multi-denominational, the revival of one religion is going to provide the unifying values that we need. We have to find some way within our societies, with all their complexity, of rediscovering that sense of belonging to the same political community, of accepting the broad mass of your fellow citizens. And this goes for people on the left and people on the right, as legitimate members of a society, of trying to reestablish some ground rules for how we can disagree, but within bounds that we both accept and that we see that disagreement as legitimate. And I think there are some difficult questions that we need to think about how we reestablish trust within these societies, how we deal with the kinds of economic changes that we're going through without people feeling that they're left behind. I think a lot of the concerns that you raise are legitimate concerns. I think concern with them is more widely shared than you than you believe, perhaps. And I think that there is a way to find working together on these things, but we have to accept some disagreement within a broader shared framework. And I believe that framework has to accept some degree of difference of values, but with a core of values that underlies it.
Thank you. Well, they've been a great panel. You've been a great audience. This has been the Budapest Global Dialogue. Thank you very much for coming, and can we give them a round of applause? Thank you.